It's with great pleasure that I welcome back Dr. Sean Patel, who's the CEO and founder of Prep Expert, the title sponsor of the College Admissions Process podcast. Sean, you have a special message for the listeners?
Hey, John, I just wanted to mention for all the parents and students who are listening to this great podcast, we have a really special offer only for listeners of the College Admissions Process podcast for Prep Expert. So, if your student is going to be taking an online SAT, ACT, PSAT course anytime soon, or is looking for one-on-one tutoring with top 1% tutors, head over to prepexpert.com. We offer live online courses for every college admissions exam. On top of that, we have the best score guarantees, best curriculum, and best instructors in the test prep industry. And just for listeners of the College Admissions Process podcast, you can get 20% off any online SAT or PSAT or ACT course, as well as one-on-one tutoring. So you can get 20% off. Just make sure you use the promo code College Talk. That's one word, College Talk, and you'll get 20% off just for listeners of the College Admissions Process podcast. And I hope you guys can use that to your advantage, save a bunch of money at prepexpert.com.
Thank you so much, Sean. And to everyone out there, once again, that promo code is College Talk. That's one word, College Talk. Thank you all, and best wishes. Welcome to The Cap, where we are here to speak with college reps and other professionals in the field of college admissions to help answer all your questions and guide you through every step of the process. So if you're serious about college admissions, you've come to the right place. Are you ready? Let's talk about it. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Durante. Welcome to The Cap, the College Admissions Process podcast. I am your host, John Durante, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Hugh Doyle, who's the Director of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of Scranton. Now, Hugh was with us back in February of 2024. Hugh, thank you so much for coming back. Can't wait to have this conversation with you. How you doing today?
Great to be back, John. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great. Things are going by quickly, though. I can't believe it's 2 years since we had our initial conversation. Can't believe the time has passed and that I've had the opportunity to come back on and have a conversation with you. It's great.
Time definitely flies by very quickly, but the beauty is that with a podcast, you can just come back and do a nice follow-up episode. So Hugh, since we last spoke, again, back in February of 2024, what notable changes or trends have you seen in the admissions landscape at the University of Scranton, whether in application volume, student interest, or how students are presenting themselves in their overall applications?
Yeah, great question. I think some competitive majors here at the University of Scranton have always been our health science majors, DPT, OT. Since our last conversation, communication sciences and disorders with the direct entry seat into speech language pathology have grown substantially. It was a very new program to Scranton at that point, but the traction is certainly picking up from its infancy. And nursing, of course, can't leave nursing out. And the volume for nursing specifically has just grown continuously, I feel, since I've been at the institution, but really notably, I think, in the past few years. It's a great program. All the health science programs are fantastic here at the institution. You know, a little biased. My wife's a graduate of the DPT program. So, she's practicing. She teaches adjunct here a little bit. She has a lot of fun in the field. Very invested into the Jesuit mission with the health sciences. It's just a great fit for those that are familiar, but you will be by the end of this conversation if you stick with us. The real difference I think I've seen generally is, we're now seeing students that weren't in high school for COVID shutdowns and things like that, which is, different than what we were seeing in the 2024 cycle when we spoke last. So while there's all the different things in terms of volume and student interests and things of that nature, I find the way students are working with us to be vastly different than they were in 2024. I don't know how you feel. I know you have your own experiences, of course, but we found, and I have found that students are speaking up for themselves and really getting out there and advocating, whether it be to ensure that you're the right choices as an institution for them to fulfill their interests or what have you, but they're out there having conversations with my team, myself, and it's been really cool to see.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing since we're many years out of COVID, that students are back. They are conversing with each other. They are advocating for themselves. And I also appreciate how you talked about all of your new programs. Nursing, of course, such a popular major all around, and you're seeing big volume there. You also mentioned that Scranton is a Jesuit institution with a strong emphasis, by the way, you mentioned the last time, on Cura Personalis, which is care for the whole person. So, Hugh, how does that mission show up when your team is actually reading applications?
Yeah, the beauty of it is that's where it starts, and it doesn't stop throughout your Scranton experience. That's a value we all at the institution hold deeply, and ensure it's active in everything we do. So mind, body, and spirit, the whole person. We are, of course, interested in the intellectual interests and abilities of an applicant and seeing how they fit into the academic picture at the University of Scranton, but also, what do they like to be involved with, how they engage with our community. And, as a Catholic Jesuit institution, it's our mission to welcome individuals of all faith backgrounds. It's not our mission to only serve students of a Catholic or Christian faith background. And we do that very well here. So I think when a student is telling us about themselves, it's important to see how they interact with the community around them in high school, because, while students may think when we talk about these Jesuit values before they're familiar with them, especially perhaps coming from a public high school or from a family with no particular faith background, they may think, well, Scranton just wants to hear about how students are involved at a church or with a religious group or something like that. But no, it's not true. Some of the most active students in the Service and Social Justice Office here at Scranton are engaged in those services and may not have a faith identity, and seeing that come through in an application is really cool, because the student may not think we're seeing it that way, but we are. We're understanding how those students can contribute and engage with our community. So the mission, to your point, to the original question, really shows up right at the beginning, right? I'm very fortunate that my staff really understands the mission, so they can really pull it out of that application. They can advocate for that student, when we get to the committee review stage and say, hey, I know you're going to see X, Y, and Z that may typically give you pause, but be sure to look at these other factors and how this student is going to be a positively contributing member to the institutional community.
Well, I really appreciate the answer, because a question that I often hear from parents is, and by the way, my daughter went to a Jesuit college as well, but they'll say, when you go to a Jesuit college, how much do they push the religious aspect of the university? And the fact is that they don't. If you want it, it's there, but they certainly don't push it. So I appreciate how you talked about how some of your most active students may not have a religious identity. And I also love how you talked about the University of Scranton is really about the whole child. You talked about mind, body, and spirit. And so, Hugh, are there academic programs, experiential learning opportunities, or support structures at Scranton that applicants should better understand before they apply?
It's a great question. Certainly institutions handle accommodations in different ways. Of course, every institution handles the required accommodations, that the government, protects the student, make sure they have those resources in front of them. But I think what's different at Scranton is our size allows our faculty and our staff to really know you as an individual. So outside of the formal resources that our Office of Student Support and Success, may have to work with the student who's in need of accommodation, all sorts of students can need support, even if it's not documented, legally required extra time on an exam or what have you. Students can need support in all sorts of different ways. And our faculty know our students so well, they're able to identify things of that nature. I had a student recently reach out to a member of my team and say, hey, kind of struggling with some coursework and I don't really know what to do. And we're close enough with our colleagues across campus that, we know who to contact in student life and advising to make sure not only is somebody going to talk to that student about academics and their struggles there, but they're also going to see, well, what else is going on? What other social resources may they need to get back on track? And in terms of formal resources, our Office of Student Support and Success does a phenomenal job with classroom-oriented accommodations. Our Title IX office handles any outside of the classroom accommodations that our students may need, whether that be in the residence halls or things like that. But then there's services that I just think are great for all sorts of students to understand that they exist. Some people may look at a curriculum and a science major at Scranton and be intimidated by it, right? How am I going to get through this physics class, this chemistry course, whatever it may be? There's tutoring, there's group tutoring, there's calculus is hard, and sometimes people feel like, well, if I don't feel prepared for it today, I'm not going to be prepared for it in a year when I need to take it. And that may be true, but you can be mature enough to seek out the help and activate the resources on campus that are going to help you through that, like peer tutoring, the Office of Student Support and Success, for more formal resources, and just connecting with faculty during office hours. Students don't really understand what that means. I think coming out of high school sometimes that it's really meant to be like, go have a conversation because your faculty want you to understand the content and, and be able to move forward. And programmatically, there's not too many formal things that I think are to call out for a high school student that don't really muddy the waters. But I think it's important to understand the robust nature through the academic, the student life, and the academic support service lenses that exist. And, the Office of Student Support and Success also, has a branch that's supporting faculty to understand how to support you better, right? It's not all about supporting the student as the student, but how can faculty be best prepared, to handle learning differences in the classroom and handle any problems students may be facing.
Well, we appreciate that. And it sounds like there are so many resources for the students, both inside and outside of your classes. A conversation that comes up a lot is if I'm a student that has a learning disability, I have an IEP while in high school, should I disclose that at the time of application or wait to be accepted and then disclose it later? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's part of the student experience story. I don't think it's something in the lens of Scranton that needs to be hidden or guarded in any way. I think it helps us understand who you are and what you've overcome and what uniqueness you would ultimately bring to the Scranton community if that's the community that you choose to join.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. And we always talk about fit. So, Hugh, are there subtle indicators in the overall application that signal a strong philosophical fit that a student may have with Scranton?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a fun one because there's about 1,000 different directions I can go with it. The cool thing about our campus community, and if you talk to Scranton alumni, I mean, I am one, class of 2017, so I'm a little biased whenever I do have these conversations, of course, right? And now the director of undergraduate admission. But when you talk to students about their experience at the University of Scranton, it is a community that is welcoming, regardless of where and how you fit into it. It's not just the student body presidents, the captain of the lacrosse team, whatever it may look like. Don't get me wrong, that student does really well here, right? And that student is able to take themselves to the next level. But the student that was nervous about dipping their toes in the water in high school, tried out for a sport, but maybe they didn't keep up with it, but loved the team, loved the camaraderie, and like they're those adjacent friends, like that student does well here too, because there's opportunities for them to challenge themselves, right? For them to, engage in intramural sports, in club sports, there's opportunities for them to go cheer on their friends similar to a high school experience. Our community loves to support one another, really no matter where you fall into that spectrum, which I find to be amazing. So, your question was, are there subtle indicators? Yeah, I think the subtle indicators to a student that fits well at Scranton are really just the students that are honest about who they are, right? And you can see that through a transcript, across through a student activities section in the Common App, across to perhaps an attached resume or a letter of recommendation. And it's really just the student that is eager and excited to participate in a community. It's a tough question to answer from my perspective of like, who doesn't fit in at Scranton. That's not something I want to be asked, right? That's not something I want to, I want students of all kinds to feel welcome here. But the student that would struggle here is the student that doesn't want to be known. The student that truly wants to fly under the radar. If you have zero willingness to engage in your community and minimal willingness to put yourself out there, even among a group that you may think is small, right? A group that may operate, in the less social circles, that's still putting yourself out there. So if you have a willingness to even do that, you're going to fit well here. But if you want to be a number in a classroom and you don't want a faculty member calling you when you don't show up for class, it's not going to be a good fit. But I think those are great things for a high school student to understand.
Well, I think that's great insight. You have an extremely engaging community where, yes, if you miss class, you might have a faculty member actually reach out to see, hey, Hugh, where were you on Friday or whatever. So I think that's fantastic. And I also love the insight that you gave in terms of be honest with who you are. Colleges are looking for two things, students. Number one, can you handle the work, right? But equally as important, what kind of community member are you going to be? So if you want to be a number and hide in a huge school, Scranton might not be the right one for you because they have an engaging community where everyone really does work together. And as far as I know, from all the students that I know that are there now and have been there in the past, it is an amazing community and people really love it. So going back to the overall application, there's something that families ask me more and more about, which is this thing we call institutional priorities. So Hugh, families often hear the phrase, but don't always understand what it actually means. Beyond building a freshman class of a certain size, what priorities most influence admissions decisions at Scranton? And are there priorities applicants rarely think about, but probably should?
Yeah, it's a great question. Priorities in that lens often shift over time, when application volumes at an institution shift, when, mission could shift a little bit. Now, mission at Scranton is very consistent, but, things like application volume and majors do change over time, things of that nature. Some of the things that we looking out for most consistently, you've already alluded to in a comment, and it's really, we want to make sure you're going to be successful at the institution because while we do have support services for you, while you can chat, in all these different ways to have academic support, social support through student life, our financial aid team is well equipped to have conversations with you about financing and education and even questions. People think that ends when you make a decision too, and it doesn't, right? It's a continuum. It's a conversation you keep having. We don't want, a student to be really set up for or find themselves in a situation where they're going to struggle to continue forward, right? For any reason, for a social reason, for an academic reason, for a financial reason. So we have always prided ourselves on being very honest with students and families about, hey, this is something you're concerned about. I hear you. I want to talk to you more about that. But this is the reality based on my experience that I see in front of us. Right. These are some of the things to be aware of. Sometimes comes up right with the student that is really set on a certain area of academic study. Right. And there's some indicators that are giving us a little pause in certain areas. But we find we may be able to find a different avenue for the student. And having those types of conversations for a student going through their college search for the first time or a family going through a college search for the first time and understanding where they may fall into an institution's priorities, right? I think it's important to look at a few things, right? It's important to look at what academic majors seem to be most competitive at that institution. Some of the things we've already talked about, like support services, is the institution spending money in support? Are they willing, to have a student that has some, yellow flags, you know, in terms of their forward progress as the institution spend the money to support the student in the journey. You know, our institutional priorities, you know, often align with things that we've already discussed in terms of best fit and academic success. So the simple answer, you know, is that. But you'll see some institutions, John, that you and I are probably very familiar with in the Northeast that have shifted greatly over the past 5 to 7 years in terms of, you know, institutional priorities, you know, maybe getting extremely, you know, more competitive or, you know, seeing great student population loss. So they're seeking to enroll students in new ways and for different programs and things they were known for many years. We've been relatively consistent in that sense, you know, in terms of our academic offerings, in terms of our freshman class size and things of that nature. So institutional priorities at Scranton can currently, you know, really be looked at in the lens of academic success, ability to afford the institution, you know, in terms of we're very out front with our financial aid packages. Ours been out for 2 months, you know, like students have time to sit with that and have conversations with us. But all in all, you know, I think it's a great point. For Scranton, we're not a highly competitive institution. You know, we're a competitive institution, but we're not down in the, you know, the low. And we'll talk about it later. But we're not down in that, you know, bottom quartile of acceptance rates by any means. So, you know, those conversations can look very differently from what we're saying right now. You know, when you get down to that sub 50%, sub 30% admit rate.
Well, we appreciate you pulling the curtain back and you giving us some insight in terms of institutional priorities, not only at Scranton, but in general with the college process. And so, obviously, one of the things that students and parents want to hear about that are listening to this conversation is the application review. So,
Mhm.
let's unpackage that a little bit, Hugh. When reviewing a transcript, what matters most to your team, and what would you say are the common misconceptions families have about what a strong transcript really looks like?
Yeah, great question. And you know, for us, there's a wide variety of indicators where we can find strength in a transcript, right? We talked about students that are successful at Scranton that are the top of their class, that are, you know, valedictorian, that have that 1400 plus SAT score. But then we've also, you know, have students that are very successful here with a 3.0 or 3.2 GPA that apply test optional, but you can still identify strengths and weaknesses in those transcripts, right? So what do we look for? Well, for a student that has struggled early in their career academically, we love to see that upward trend, which I'm sure you hear, right? We love to see a trajectory. But also it's awesome to even see some flatlining when a student's taken on those higher courses, the rigorous courses and some APs, some honors, you know. That's okay to see a little stagnation, you know, in an upward trend. But you know, it's February and we're looking at second read applications or students that were asked to interview and those senior year grades are important to see some of those continued trends for some of the students that may have been on the cusp, you know. For students that are interested in the STEM fields, I think it's really important to show that you've challenged yourself with the courses. I don't think that it's necessarily indicative of how successful you're going to be in a class your freshman year of college just because you got a C in chemistry your freshman year in high school. I think there's a lot of growth that has happened between those two periods of time. And if you can show that you've been successful in other STEM courses and in the meantime, I think that can show strength in a transcript. So, you know, I hope that that's not challenging too greatly any, you know, positive perceptions of what a strong transcript looks like because I think there can be different definitions. You can also have a 3.9 student at some schools that have never taken an AP or an honors class that are going to struggle in a different way going into a, you know, biochemistry major than a student that maybe has a slightly lower GPA and has challenged themselves in some ways.
Hey, podcast friends, if you've been enjoying the College Admissions Process podcast, I'm excited to share my new book, Straight from the Admissions Office, Insider Strategies for College Applications. It's packed with insights and tips from over 250 podcast episodes with admissions professionals designed to make the college process less overwhelming. Whether you're a student, parent, or college counselor, it's a valuable resource for navigating the admissions process. By grabbing a copy, you're also helping to support the podcast. The links are in the show notes. Thank you, and best wishes to all with the college admissions process.
Well, I really love how you compare different types of students with different GPAs, but also the types of courses that they may or may not have taken throughout their 4 years of high school. Now, you also mentioned that some students are selected for an interview. Can you just elaborate on that? Like, is it everyone? Is it just some? When do you get selected for an interview? And how should one prepare for that interview? What are you looking for?
It's a great question. So we're trying to be very quick and upfront when we think that this is going to be a key indicator to the decision. So students would know if they applied early action to Scranton as soon as December 15th of their senior year that we're looking to have that conversation. And decisions actually, are typically released to those students coming up here pretty soon in early March, mid-March. So we give them some time. People's schedules are different. People have sports, things of that nature. So we try not to, I had students that interviewed January 5th, right? Like right after the holiday, but they're not necessarily judged differently than a student that took a trip up to Scranton in the past 2 weeks. We try and be reasonable with that, just to set the expectation we have until this timeline to get it done. But, who would be selected? Well, somebody that we want to be sure has the tools to be successful at Scranton, even though that they may have not appeared to be achieving academically at a level that you would more commonly find being accepted to the institution. So the students that, maybe did show an upward trend, but they started in a little bit of a trench, their freshman year, first year of high school, and they dug themselves up, but really hard to numerically change some things, right? Averages are averages. You really have 3 years of high school to play with here in terms of building a cumulative GPA. If you start in certain positions, we just want to be sure that we've read that transcript the right way, John, right? We've understood that trend correctly, and we can see how that student can be supported by the institution, but bring the tools to use the support to be successful, right? I think there's a key distinction in that.
Well, we really appreciate it. And digging deeper, unpackaging the overall application, you and your team read thousands, I'm sure, of personal statements each year. What separates an essay that's memorable from one that simply is just fine?
It's a great question. I think it ties back to an earlier comment I made. When you can look at an application and see consistency across like a transcript and activities and letters of recommendation, and then you pile in the student essay, right? And people have always say, I feel like it's a topic at every conference. Well, AI and student essays and whatnot, right? But the way we're approaching the essay and the way our team is reading them, yeah, there's your basic review, right? There's key things you're looking for in terms of structure and this, that, and the other thing. But it really is to understand who the student is when we're reading the essay. Like, we really want to know who you are. When I meet students out on the road, or my team does, I implore students to think about, this is the only blank page you have here, right? Every other page is so structured, right? Your transcript is structured by your high school. The activities section of the Common App is structured by the Common App. Sure, you can send a resume if we want to get technical, right? But I mean, this is your blank slate. And you can really tell when a student uses that blank slate to tie their whole picture together, right? They tie together their academic history a little bit, but there's so many other things to tell that story, right? But you see where the academic history comes in, but you see where those activities come in. You see where their community outreach as a student, a student that volunteers, that spends time out with their friends in the community or partaking in things that are making the world around them a better place. But we love to see those things come together in an essay. So, when thinking as to what we're looking for, that, raw student story, I would prefer over like the polished, the hyper polished, like a topical essay about whatever is going on in the world at the time, because there are Common App prompts that can get you there. And there are students that do a nice job with that. But I really love to hear about, just how the entire application can be tied together for a student, through what they're putting on paper in the essay.
Well, I really appreciate how you talked about the fact that the essay or the personal statement, that's really a blank slate compared to things like the transcript, which hopefully you have great grades in ninth, 10th, and 11th grade. You're showing the trajectory, you're showing the ramps that you built, the activity sheet. By the time you're submitting applications, hopefully you have a list of strong activities that you've taken part in throughout high school. But that personal statement, you're right, it's a blank slate. Students are starting it fresh. And so that's why I think many of them have anxiety about it. So, Hugh, are there essay themes or approaches that feel overused in the application review and others that tend to work well, for example, when students are trying to talk about themselves authentically?
Yeah, I think the overused question I always find to be interesting because there's a lot that are commonly used, right? But I don't know if I like categorizing it that way because for some students, it's super relevant, right? You'll hear the anecdote from higher education professionals like, oh, you hear about twisted my ankle freshman year soccer, changed my high school trajectory completely. And, and then the next paragraph, they're like back on the field 3 games later, but this is just like a memory that stuck out for them. Fine. Maybe that's an example. But I think the student that faced that instance, right? That twisted ankle, that major injury, and then took that and turned it into a new part of their identity and showed how they could, approach a challenge and discover this whole new, world for them. I particularly remember an essay that was like that, right? Early in a high school career, somebody had a sport injury, everything changed, and it turns out, by junior year, well, and they had never like stood up in front of a group of people and spoken before. And then by junior year, like they're the lead in the school play. And now they want to come to Scranton as a biology major because they want to go to medical school because of the experience they had with that injury, but also they're excited about theater and the student art leave arts company on campus, like all this stuff. It's like that's not overused, right? Because they used it to really leverage their story. And I just think there's those common themes, and perhaps they're a little overdone, but they're not when you use it to really leverage who you are and how you're going to contribute to a campus community, and by also showing how you can handle adversity. So I think when you layer all those things together, I don't think I'm a believer in overused.
Well, I appreciate the example in terms of the student really leveraging the story, the injury in ninth grade. Now, all of a sudden, he got interested in bio because of the injury. And oh, by the way, he was the lead in the play. So, in other words, using the topic to really bring all of the pieces together, I think that's a great point, as opposed to just saying, I love soccer, I got hurt, and now I don't play soccer anymore. Which, if you look at an activity sheet, that probably, explains that pretty well right there. Another piece in the overall application is the additional information section, which many people truly misunderstand. Hugh, when should a student use it and when should they avoid it? Can you share an example of a student who used the space effectively to add context without coming across as making any excuses?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like it ties really nicely into the topic we just spoke about. So, kudos there for the placement, John. And I think it really shows that if a student approaches the essay in the way that an institution like Scranton likes to see it, right, and to really tie their picture together in a positive light, right, show how I'm going to be a contributor to your community, to show how and you can speak generally. You don't have to use the word Scranton in the essay to still hit the mark that kind of what I'm trying to get across is how you're going to be a really great contributing member to the institution. But you also had like maybe this trip up, right? Second semester of sophomore year, you saw some obvious not straight trajectories happening across academic coursework and academic achievement. And you'd like to take that opportunity to say, this is what, I was faced with. And this is how I handled it, and this is how I recorrected, that trajectory. I don't know if I find it useful if it's a flat line type of thing, Unless, there's some great examples of students, unlocking answers to questions they've had, right? Students that are newly diagnosed with a learning disability, newly accommodated in a different way following conversations with school counseling and psychiatry and, all these things. And it can tell that story. But I think it's best used in those instances, rather than the essay. Some students think I need to talk about these challenges in my essay, but I do find the additional information to be the better time to talk about that. So you can use the essay to build yourself up, and not necessarily focus on the hey, FYI, this is what was going on here. I hope you can see that I faced this challenge and have moved on successfully, rather than using, as I just said, that blank slate, that one opportunity, and kind of clogging it up.
Well, we really appreciate that. And it goes back to what we talk a lot about throughout the podcast episodes, which is students, when you're submitting your application, the person reading it is probably a stranger. So you want to make sure that you provide an overall comprehensive view of who you are, right? The academics, the type of community member that you're going to be, what makes you tick, your thought process. And so if there's something missing in the overall application, using the additional information section to fill in those gaps will help you, right? It's not going to hurt you. It will help you if there's some context that you need to share, perhaps a dip in grades in 10th grade. Perhaps you're a student that was not only in two, but you were in three different high schools throughout your time. And so maybe you want to share that context as to why throughout that additional information section. Now, another part is the activity section of the Common Application, Hugh, and students only get about 150 characters, not words, but 150 characters, which can feel incredibly limiting. So from an admissions perspective, what actually makes an activity description effective? And can you share an example of a student who used that limited space to their advantage?
Great question. I think it's best used, in my personal opinion, to show how this activity built into who you are overall as a person, right? If you are listing soccer captain, soccer captain for your member, I get the idea. And that's great. You climb the ladder, you're a team leader, you're consistent contributor, and you're respected by your peers. That's just from the title, right? So, I love to see in that activities description section where, again, only 150 characters are used. I love to see things like, balancing soccer during AP testing season, or lacrosse during AP testing season, you know, challenged my abilities to blank. It was a great learning experience. Like, I love to see things like that. How it shows, like, okay, an admissions professional went to high school, they've went through college, they have friends that are very active on campuses and things. So I love to see in those activity section how that activity challenged your ability to balance your world, right? And how you are leveraging it. I know that's a big ask, but if you can keep that really brief, right? With a spring sport and APs, or a fall sport and SAT prep. And it doesn't all have to be the academic piece, right? Maybe you're that athlete that's still involved in the theater club, or that's involved in student government, and you're planning homecoming and you're doing these things. So super brief. I wouldn't waste time explaining the activity very much. I think a lot of them are self-explanatory. I think using that as a very brief opportunity to show your personal strength and your personal abilities to balance a wide variety of activities and academic prowess is much better suited, which I know can be kind of counterintuitive to the structure. But again, people reading this are familiar with the 90% of the time the sport you're describing. Maybe if it's something that involves massive amounts of travel, that's great to mention, right? Because it can show, there's some Jesuit schools that I'm familiar with across the East Coast, Jesuit high schools, that are like the only private high school, a Jesuit high school for miles around, right? So if you play football at some of these Jesuit high schools, you're driving 5 hours on a Friday to compete Saturday morning in a football game because nobody will play you locally, right? That's relevant to me because that's different, right? And, my public high school my my friends that played football didn't face that challenge, right? So, I think, focusing on the uniqueness of the situation is the best way to use the area.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, it's the importance of sharing any context. Exactly what you said. If you're on a team that has to travel hours to play because you're in a remote area, providing that context is really, really important. And of course, another piece of the overall application are these things called recommendation letters. So, Hugh, what do strong letters of recommendations do particularly well? And what makes a letter less helpful, even when it's written positively?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer the back half first, if you don't mind, about what makes a well-written letter less helpful. A student that has shown certain indicators, of struggle, right, through their academic experience or social experience, and a letter is just well written and positive, like that's fantastic, and I'm so happy that student is perceived that way, by individuals in the counseling office or their educators. But it's hard to then understand how those two things justify, like, and how those two things are true, and they can be true, for the record, right? Like, I'm not saying something's wrong here. No, but it's really helpful to understand the perception of the professional, the counselor, the educator, their perception of how the student has risen to certain occasions. I think the best recommendation letters are, yeah, I know this student struggled in this area and they reached out and utilized these resources and challenged, myself and my professional peers to figure out how we could support them. And then they took that information and ran with it. Like, I don't think they'll have to be overwhelmingly positive to be the strongest of a letter of recommendation, but generally I find it super helpful when a letter really shows that they know the student and that they understand what they're going to contribute, again, to a campus community. We spoke about earlier, you know, institutional missions and institutional goals and enrollment. And I hope I've made it very clear that Scranton is on the search for best fit students. And so those letters that can show fit, I think are really helpful to see.
Well, you've made it very clear, and I think you're right. The importance of having students that show the right fit, both academically and also as part of your engaging community, because you want to admit students, number one, that are going to stay, because these things called retention rates in terms of how many students continue after freshman year are very important. But also, you want to make sure that students that are coming are able to graduate after 4 years, because those things are obviously very important to the University of Scranton and any other college or university. So I appreciate you talking about that fit, which is so important. Hugh, after years in admissions, what's a question you wish more families would ask you, but often they just don't?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I have really been giving this one some thought prior to our conversation, to be honest. And one thing I wish, families and students would ask more of is, what does the institution offer, right? To me, to my family, to my student, that is unique to the institution, or how can my family and how can my student ensure that we are utilizing the institutional resources that may or may not be unique to the best of our ability? I often get that question asked in a different way of, like, do you have X resource? Do you have Y resource? Many institutions do, right? 90% of the schools you're looking at, have these resources. I think it's much more important for the family to understand how to access them and understand the hurdles that could be in front of the student that are often simply raising their hand, and simply reaching out and connecting with somebody in one of these offices. So I feel like students and families are very focused on, does the institution have the resource? Less so, what are the hurdles to accessing it?
I think that's such a great point. And some of the hurdles is that when students are in high school, they have so many supports in terms of the parents coming to the high school to meet with counselors and what have you. But in college, it's really the student that has to learn to advocate for themselves. So, for example, the University of Scranton has many resources, as you so beautifully described, but the student has to learn to absolutely advocate for themselves because you're not necessarily going to have your parent being able to just call to get those things for you. So, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Before we get to the last question, Hugh, I always like to ask, is there a question that I didn't ask about the University of Scranton or anything else in college admissions? Is there a question that I didn't ask that you wish I had? Or is there a topic that simply didn't come up that you'd like to share with our audience now?
Yeah, I think we touched on questions I expected to, but I would love to make a little bit of a statement regarding Scranton and the community that students are welcomed into here and how transformative a Jesuit education can be for a family. And I think, we talked about it a little earlier on about the different religious identities or lack thereof of individuals at the University of Scranton. And, it saddens me when families think of our religious identity as a barrier to their interest in the institution because of just the good work that's done here, the great people that it's done by, and the really well-grounded mission that the institution has, of course, grounded in the Jesuit ideals as they are. But, people often get nervous, right? That it's we use the word transformative education, and it's transforming a student into Catholicism, right? And it's not the point. It's transforming students into men and women for and with others to go forward and make a great impact on the world around them, and challenge them to think differently, challenge them to see perspectives that they're unfamiliar with. And it happens no matter the background. And when families are filtering out schools because of, religious identity as one factor, which for the record, I understand if a student does not have a certain religious background, they're like, well, why would I look here? But so many students in this generation, especially, just want to do good, right? They want to be good people. They want to be productive members of society that love their neighbor. And that's what the Jesuit mission is all about. So I just really wanted to be clear about that for people that have stuck with us for this conversation and can really understand how great of a fit a Jesuit education can be for students that have that desire, especially here at the University of Scranton.
Well, I'm glad you definitely made that clarification because, like I said, my daughter went to a Jesuit college not too far from Scranton, by the way, and she absolutely loved it. And people ask me all the time, is it something that they try to indoctrinate you in? And the answer is absolutely not. If you want it, it's there, but there's definitely a lot of students that don't have, for example, a Catholic background or who necessarily even identify, as you said earlier, with a certain religion. So, Hugh, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Unfortunately, it does lead us to that last question, which always is, what are your top three pieces of advice for students and their families getting ready for the college admissions process?
Absolutely. And I love the question. Number one, sticker price should not be a filtering item for you. Final cost can be, when you get a financial aid package or a merit-based scholarship package. I'm not going to sit here and tell you not to consider cost. We live in a very cost-sensitive environment, and that's fine. That is your right to make those decisions that way. But apply to schools, apply to schools you love, right? And see what those packages ultimately look like. Second piece is seek best fit. Institutional reputation is obviously super important. You want to go to the school that's going to help you elevate to the next level, but that doesn't always mean it has to be a national flagship state institution. There are alumni of the University of Scranton that are CEOs of Big Four accounting firms, the past commissioner of the Pennsylvania State Police. I mean, there's all sorts of individuals from a mid-sized institution in the Northeast. I'll by talking about ourselves here, that have made this great impact. So don't take a school off just because, there's not 15 or 18,000 people in a first year class and you don't think the network's strong enough. I challenge you to dig a little deeper on that. And last but not least, visit campuses. I know I just said best fit was number 2, but sometimes I feel like people do a lot of online shopping these days. There's a lot of really great marketing tools out there. There's a lot of very talented photographers out there. I challenge you to come see it for yourself or go see it for yourself, wherever that may be. So, don't take a school off the list because of cost. Seek out the best fit for you and get some feet on campus.
Well, I think those are tremendous pieces of advice. And it's clear that Scranton is so lucky to have you, as were we, Hugh, during this conversation. You gave so many insights. I really appreciate you pulling the curtain back on the overall application review. You're awesome. Looking forward to seeing you again next year at NACAC and having you in the future back on the podcast. Thank you so much, Hugh.
Thanks, John. It was great being here.
It was our pleasure and honor. And to everyone out there, good luck with the college search. Take care all, and best wishes.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the CAP, the College Admissions Process Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please don't forget to tell a friend and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. I am your host, John Durante, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the CAP. Thank you for listening to the College Admissions Process Podcast presented by Prep Expert. Prep Expert offers live online SAT and ACT courses with the best score guarantees, instructors, and curriculum. Go to prepexpert.com to guarantee your child's success.